lately, I kind of feel like I've been going crazy.
The world feels upside down pretty much in every way. Politics everywhere are all screwed up, foreign and domestic alike. The world economy is likely to nosedive anytime soon. And influencers, slop content, quick AI-assisted summaries for those too tired or lazy to make up their own opinions, and algorithms meant to serve the worst part of human nature, sow division while the rich and powerful use the chaos to transfer what little remaining wealth the working class has left in their pockets.
Yeah, man, if there's ever been a time where I felt the need to unplug, it's right about now.
And the crazy thing is, even when it comes to gaming, a hobby that I've been involved with for most of my life, a hobby that has always served as my preferred method of escapism, even in this once sacred realm, all of that bullshit remains front and center. There is no escape. Tariffs and corporate greed are making even older consoles more expensive than they've ever been. Those all-you-can-eat services that have been used as ways to further consolidate studios into near monopolies are getting more and more expensive, and freemium models are now the norm. And this has led to new titles that feel instantly dated except for the fun and new ways that they have figured out how to peel money from your wallet. And then there is the press and the reactions to all this stuff. Game reviews on legacy outlets have more or less been completely outsourced to a freelance model, which makes them nothing more than a revolving door of people trying to get their hot takes in as soon as a game is released before they run off to make their next buck somewhere else. Sometimes outright plagiarizing the work of other writers wholesale in order to get their next paycheck faster, or in the best case, they are writing slop assisted with ChatGPT prompts.
And then the influencer side is just as crazy.
Video games, no matter how benign, are pretty much always being co-opted as currency in an ongoing culture war. And the loudest and most vocal are always the most cringe.
Sorry, did you want to get immersed in our world? Yeah, well, guess what? Fucking pronouns! Fucking gender ambiguity!
More titties and everything please, or we riot, and if we detect anything woke, it's on site.
Yeah, I've pretty much tapped out.
When it comes to my preferred hobbies, gaming, reading, music, what have you, I just check out what looks cool to me. I don't care if it's new, I don't care if it's old. And here on YouTube, I don't care about whether or not my videos are timely or primed to hit the algorithm. I mean, clearly. I read things that seem important, I find music in all the weirdest places, and I play a bunch of games that no one else is really talking about. I am a crate digger at heart. And when it comes to outside influence, I have a few channels and individuals that I follow in order to put me onto things that are just outside of my orbit. Thor High Heels, Aaron Signal, Alex Navarro. If those guys tell me to check something out, I'm more than likely to follow. But other than that, it's just me and a handful of friends, with friend of the channel Concord Chris being the most usual suspect.
Me and my crew.
If you've been following my channel, I'm sure you've noticed the trend. Mostly smaller games, usually indie in nature, or at the very least in that special B game realm, cult classics, and then of course the occasional tentpole release if it has something to do with a franchise or genre that I've already established interest in. Titan Chaser is still my personal favorite game that I've played on this channel, as far as personal impact is concerned. Control is one of my all-timers, but that goes back to growing up with Remedy, and for some reason, I still love Titanfall 2. My tastes are all over the place, but I really wouldn't want it any other way. And recently I found myself with some rewards cash from a big box retailer, and I decided to pick up a few newer releases. Silent Hill F, Death Stranding 2, Final Fantasy Tactics: The Ivalice Chronicles, and Lost Soul Aside. Tactics and Death Stranding 2 are both still sealed as of the time of this writing, so I've been playing the other two concurrently. But one has been an incredible slog to get through, regularly pushing me away from it with its tedious combat, up its own ass narrative, and design philosophy that feels like it is a step back from its contemporaries. And the other is Lost Soul Aside, which I completely devoured. But again, in this modern era of hot takes, disposable reviews, and even hashtag ads passing as true analysis, Silent Hill F is somehow in this weird space where, depending on who you ask, the game is either a brave new direction for a beloved series, or it is the continuation of the downward trend that the series has been on since Team Silent left the franchise over 20 years ago with Silent Hill 4: The Room. I haven't completely wrapped up my time with it, but so far, I'm underwhelmed. But I don't have the same connection to the old games that the more angry voices share. So I'll mostly keep the opinions to myself until I ultimately decide to take a more nuanced dive into it. But then there is Lost Soul Aside. Take a quick look on Metacritic or YouTube, and this game just kind of came and went. It received middling reviews, and the sales numbers have been downright underwhelming. And then the online discourse has been completely dismissive and usually features a healthy dose of anti-Chinese sentiment. But as far as I was concerned, I vaguely remembered a trailer from nearly 10 years ago that looked pretty, saw that the game was dropping when I was picking up some new shit, and told the clerk to put the Lost Soul aside in the bag. And fuck me, I could not disagree with the general discourse more if I tried. I'll explain why over the rest of this video, but long story short, LSA is not only one of the best character action games that I've ever played, but it is my current contender for Game of the Year. And trust me, I know that might sound insane. For the uninitiated, Lost Soul Aside is a game that spent over a decade in development, starting all the way back in 2014. And originally it was a solo project by first-time Chinese game dev, Yang Bing. Lost Soul Aside started as something of an interactive fan project. After watching a trailer for Final Fantasy Versus 13, or what would eventually become FF15, Bing began envisioning his own dream project, with Versus being something of a style guide and a massive inspiration. And over the next year he began teaching himself game design, modeling, and programming, all within Epic's Unreal Engine 4. All while working with international tech groups and leaving his hometown of Hungshui in order to study in South Korea. He learned the basics, came up with design docs, and crafted the outline of the game's world and story. And eventually he published a 5-minute short film and prototype, which was the culmination of his then 2 years of work on his passion project, before submitting the video online and also including it in his job applications. But once it was online, this one-man show went completely viral, with the video boasting over 4 million views as of today's writing. And with that exposure came tons of domestic job offers, but not wanting to end up working in mobile development, which is kind of the industry standard in China, and given the opportunity to potentially head his own project, Bing decided to partner with Sony. And with the help of funding from Sony's China Hero Initiative, a program in which Sony was scouting and funding Chinese game devs in order to find new talent in new markets, Bing founded what would become UltiZero Games in 2017, getting help for the first time on his project and expanding the team to include less than 5 people. But it was at this time where pre-production began in earnest. The new team was able to finish pre-production in 2018 and then created a demo for Gamescom of that year, in which UltiZero, then consisting of around 10 people, were able to crank out a boss battle demo for that convention after just 2 weeks of intense work. The team was figuring things out, but they were running into problems. And up until 2020, UltiZero had been working on a version of Lost Soul Aside that was supposed to be largely open world in design. But the team was hemorrhaging money, and with the need to pay around 20 people by this point, Bing decided to scrap the project and restart development altogether, all while including a much smaller scope. And with this 2020 refresh, funding was tighter than ever, and the staff was frustrated. And it was really at this point that UltiZero was put into a corner. Unable to afford senior talent, UltiZero became a haven for mobile developers trying to get into the AA space, and for newcomers who could learn on the job. But then the pandemic hit, and UltiZero, which was then comprised of 30 different members of wildly different experience levels, was forced to work remotely amid the strict Chinese lockdown restrictions. Between 2021 and 2023, the development pipeline slowed down to a crawl, with developers working from home on tasks independently and then sending them to Yang Bing to integrate them into the larger project. Suffice it to say, the game was in development hell. And with tight budgets and a slowed down turnaround, many of the staff at UltiZero left to work for larger companies like Paper Games, Tencent, and NetEase, leaving Bing with the impression that UltiZero was little more than a stepping stone company, a place for people to learn their craft and build their portfolio before leaving the company altogether. But after lockdown fully lifted in 2023, Bing was able to take LSA into full production. They were back in the office and building up the ranks to a staff that was just over 40 people, and it is at this time where the final version of Lost Soul Aside really came into focus. But with the game finally barreling towards completion, more and more complications started popping up. Sony mandated story rewrites as led by a team of writers who had worked on God of War Ragnarok and Horizon Zero Dawn. And it is at this time that the original plot of LSA was heavily edited down, taking what was once a 10-chapter game and boiling it down to a length of just half that. The game was delayed multiple times, and the rewrites were taking their toll on the staff. with it being the case that a lot of the stuff that was removed from the story were plot beats that the Sony staff deemed too specific to a Chinese audience. And it is at this time that one key planner and designer sided with the worldwide approach, leading to some controversy when the designer posted some racist remarks that got her fired. But when you have a giant corporation coming into a passion project, all of this was the cost of doing business. The China Hero Initiative may have been the partnership that allowed Yang Bing to make his dream project and make his studio, but Sony was the publisher and the company bankrolling the venture. And with the tech juggernaut wanting to send this project out to a worldwide release, they took creative control away from the studio where they saw fit. Lost Soul Aside was released on August 29, 2025 worldwide, and it was reportedly made with a budget of around $8 million over the span of nearly a decade. And just for a comparison, that is roughly 20% of the budget for something like Black Myth Wukong. And as I've already stated, reception to the game was pretty underwhelming, middling review scores, bad word of mouth, if there was word of mouth at all, with some comparing this relatively unsupported new release to something like Concord, which was the last big flop from Sony.
Me and my crew.
And even though sales information is sparse, all evidence points to LSA being a huge flop with pretty embarrassing sales figures. And then there was a particularly horrifying anecdote in which a live stream was done by UltiZero in order to drum up interest in the game in its domestic market, and over the course of this 1 hour live stream, UltiZero was only able to move a grand total of 4 copies during its runtime. But always being one to check out things that interest me, no matter how doomed they appear to be from the outside, I picked the game up, and now here I am on the other side of having completed it. So what is Lost Soul Aside? And keep in mind, there will be light spoilers for this game from this point on in the video. The easiest breakdown is pretty simple. This is a character action game in the vein of something like Devil May Cry or Final Fantasy XVI, and like FF16, this is a title that offers some light role-playing elements in order to keep the stylish action expanding as the game moves forward through its set pieces and narrative. As far as the narrative is concerned, early hours of LSA are fairly no frills. This is a millennia-old conflict between nations, an evil empire that is hell-bent on controlling the world and subjecting its peoples, and then there's a ragtag group of anti-fascists called Glimmer trying to bring power back to the people. You play as Kaiser, one of the more generic good guy characters I've ever seen in a game, and someone who could not have been more inspired by Noctis if you tried. But considering that Versus 13 was the seed for this project all along, I guess we can celebrate the black metal graphic on Kaiser's undershirt and small ponytail, which act as the sole signifiers that we are playing as a character legally distinct enough from the Crown Prince of Lucius, so we don't get sued.
Wow, well, is that a Powerpuff Girl or something?
No, can you not see if she has a mohawk and a wheelchair? We're not getting sued.
And similar to something like Final Fantasy VII or plenty of other fantasy stories of its ilk, LSA does a lot with very little to establish its tone. Class distinctions are heavy within the Empire of Celestria. You have the Imperial Core behind a large sci-fi fantasy castle wall, and then you have the slums and the docks where the poors try their best to survive under the exploitative and authoritarian Holy Order, who are magically enhanced stooges for the Empire. Believe me, we've seen all of this before, and when it comes to the early plot beats in Lost Soul Aside, a lot of this can come across as paint by numbers for well-worn tropes. The Holy Order can be Soldier from FF7, Glimmer can be seen as Avalanche, and even your first order of business, crashing an Empire parade in order to try and get the people to rise up against their oppressors, is a pretty clear analog to the whole Mako reactor bombing mission. We meet the Glimmer crew, a mix of normal people like your sister Louisa and compatriot Celine, and gifted ones, this game's term for people who can do the dope magic shit, like Kaiser, Gethia, who is an archaeologist who can teleport, and Zana, who is this game's de facto martial artist and potential love interest. So you do the thing, you and Louisa, against Kaiser's better judgment, go and set off the signal for the revolution. And then all hell breaks loose. A dimensional alien invasion, some fights with the Holy Order, and the Voidrax extraterrestrial threat. And Kaiser is introduced to the secondary protagonist, a massive dragon-like dimensional being who has been having his powers siphoned to act as the energy source for the Empire. A character who lends his powers to Kaiser and allows for the title to really step into the stylish character action arena. It really should be stated that this game's intro does very little to distinguish itself from other fantasy action games. A basic setup, characters that are kind of tropes in and of themselves, and then when it comes to the early iteration of LSA's gameplay, things can certainly feel undercooked. Really basic strings that can be punctuated with heavy attacks, basic to the point where they feel like they come from the same realm as something like early Kingdom Hearts. A dodge roll that doesn't do much in the way of mobility, and then platforming that doesn't really do much to improve this game's first impression. Seriously, Kacer's default jump is just whack. Far more vertical than horizontal, and then the platforming is a bit on the exact side for such an underwhelming option. And then there are some stumbles with early cutscene audio problems and melodramatic moments that do little to inspire. But once Arena is introduced, the game starts to slowly come into its own, and as it weaves its way through its runtime, it only improves from that point on. Attack strings start to give way to far more options, range attacks are hinted at, area of effect skills that work on a cooldown offer a good early get the fuck off me option in the thick of things, a quick devil trigger analog, and then most important to this game's kit, the dash. As far as defensive tools go, the dash is pretty self-explanatory. Use it for repositioning, and if you use it within a tight enough window, you get a perfect evade with all sorts of follow-up actions and the requisite screen freeze to let you know that you just did some hot shit. But as a utility, this dash is absolutely busted in practice. And by that I mean busted in a way that immediately begins to elevate what is truly possible within LSA's combat engine. Everything, and I mean everything, in LSA is dash cancelable. Your attack string is about to end? Dash and begin a new one for lockdown. Want to get back to the ground instantly? Double tap that shit in the air to blink yourself down to the floor like Resident Evil's Wesker in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. No matter what it is, no matter how pre-canned the animation, no matter where you are on the screen, dashing in LSA offers up a degree of freedom unlike just about anything I've ever seen in a character action game. And it turns a game with wind-up animations and cooldown skills into something where you always have the ability to steal back priority. I know on paper this sounds like a small thing. Most hack and slash games have a dodge mechanic, but here a single push of L1 is how you consistently squeeze the most out of this game, all while giving you a bevy of follow-up actions. And most importantly, creative freedom. If I were to compare it to something that I've seen in another character action game, this button operates similarly to Dante's Trickster stance from Devil May Cry, an enemy step mechanic in utility. And once this mobility option is combined with a double jump mechanic that is introduced at the same time, mobility in this title opens up to a ridiculous degree. And this is all while the game is operating at a buttery 60 frames per second. And I really cannot overstate how good all of this feels in practice. The freedom of movement, being able to use a cooldown skill only then to dash out as soon as the buff activates, canceling the parts of the animations that are just there for show. Even this early on, Kacer became one of my favorite characters to control in just about any video game. And compared to the options that are available to you as this game evolves, all of this is fucking nothing. But even with these new fancy powers, the alien forces are far too much for one man and his new powers to contend with. They run through the city wreaking havoc, and eventually things take a more personal toll when Luisa is attacked by one of the larger Voidraks and it ends up snatching up her soul.
Your brother's soul is mine.
From this point on, the focus of the game evolves. Even if on a conceptual level, it still remains fairly straightforward. Learn how to contend with not only the Voidrak's threat, but also see what can be done to return not only Luisa's, but everyone else's soul who has been taken by these dimensional beings. And from this point on, the game becomes about unraveling the mysteries at the core of this game's conflict. What are the Voidraks? Who is controlling them? Who is Arena? Can we beat back the fascists? And why the hell is this real doll this game's save mechanic? Once this game opens up, once you're out of the starting town, it is here where it becomes an honest-to-God character action game. But because of this game's arduous development cycle, again, there is quite a bit of unevenness in the early hours. Corridor-based level design that gives way to combat arenas, minor puzzle sequences, and of course those choke points and exploration sequences that act as disguised loading zones. I mean, come on, it's a Sony-published game after all. And then an aesthetic that favors green and brown ruins and old world architecture. But this is just a slice of what this game has to offer, and it should be said that this early look of what Lost Soul Aside actually is what UltiZero surfaced as the vertical slice and released as a demo. And I truly think that they made a terrible mistake in doing so. First, given LSA's crazy long development time, it should come as no real surprise that the tech here powering this game is extremely dated. Lost Soul Aside is powered by the Unreal 4 engine, and outside of some key late game environments, this game looks it. But the demo also showed off the game's combat and level design at its most uninspiring, and without access to the full kit that makes up this game's identity. Like most character action games, Kaser eventually finds himself juggling new weapons and powers as you progress, and for the demo, only the first two weapons were available, the standard straight sword and the berserk-inspired greatsword. And while each of these weapons has their own combo strings and utility, and you can seamlessly switch between the two with the tap of a button, neither of these weapons are truly showcased in terms of breadth and depth of what they can actually do in combat. In the demo, the greatsword is the big weapon for crippling an enemy's stagger gauge and piling on the damage, and the straight sword is there for mobility and peppering an enemy with quick hits. But in the actual game, as you upgrade your kit, as you are layering on the area of effect powers, the utility and room for experimentation of both of these weapons grow exponentially. And before I get into gushing about all of that, I'm going to say that I've read quite a few reviews of this game, I've watched a few videos, I've checked to see what people are saying about it, and I truly don't believe that most critics spent much time with this title past what they were shown in this demo. And if they did, I strongly suspect that they abused some key items to lower the difficulty of this game altogether. Because the criticisms, the boring story, the drab environments, the awful platforming, and the flashy but shallow combat, while I certainly can understand those arguments from someone who only played the first two chapters of this game, they do not jibe with me as someone who has explored everything and ate up all of the content that is here. And I strongly suspect that most of the reviews out there were far more influenced by this vertical slice than the game itself. In execution, sadly, Lost Soul Aside feels like the type of game where they made 10 years worth of content for it, all at varying levels of quality as their team size fluctuated time and time again. But when it came time for them to string together all of their work, UltiZero was far less concerned about using the best stuff early on to make the best impression, and instead opted to ramp up the quality as the game progressed. The story, while it never makes its way to something truly groundbreaking, it improves exponentially as the stakes continue to be raised. Side characters like Zana and Victor go from being genre tropes to something far more interesting as their backstories are fleshed out, and as the calamity that is threatening to destroy this world is being expanded upon. Ahriman, the big bad guy, the leader of the Voidrax threat, is consistently becoming slimier and more manipulative as the plot barrels towards its completion, and even the more two-dimensional characters like Kaser and Emperor Highcastle feel like they are more or less fleshed out by the time the credits roll. At its core, this is a story about how the common folk can band together and take on a threat much larger than themselves through cooperation and solidarity. And while defeating a world-ending threat through the power of friendship is hardly something that has never been done in this genre, it is fairly well done here, not only through its cutscenes, but also directly through its gameplay. But more on that in a bit. As far as the overall presentation of the game is concerned and its environmental design, I can say confidently what is shown up front here is the worst that the game has to offer. The green and brown expanses that would feel right at home in the worst parts of admittedly good titles in this genre like Nier and Final Fantasy XV, those rolling green hills and ruins from a bygone era. But once this game really starts to tap into more varied locales inspired by Chinese mythology and geography, that is really when this game starts to shine. And some of these locations, specifically like this Tibetan-inspired village, really start to show off what UltiZero's art team is capable of. And especially late game locales become downright gorgeous. It is in this incredibly varied quality of level and art design where it is hard not to see what happened here. With the earliest build of LSA favoring a far more open world design structure, the rolling hills and more scenic vistas, the locations that this game forces you through in the opening chapters reflect that more open but generally empty aesthetic. Environments that existed for a scrapped version of the game that were then retooled for a more linear progression, not unlike what happened over the protracted development of Remedy's Alan Wake. But as this game progresses, the linear set pieces and design ethos really step into full focus, creating environments that eventually feel far more authored and deeply memorable. Seriously, since I finished playing this, there are certain locales that have been living rent-free in my mind. Not just because of some amazing art direction, but also in some specific cases, some pretty mind-blowing lighting and technical chops that feel like they are pushing the aging UE4 engine to its breaking point. The quest here that keeps the game moving is pretty simple. gather up support, try to stave off Ahriman from gathering more power and spreading his corruption. And that has you globetrotting, making new alliances, and fighting bosses all along the way. But with the Voidrax being extra-dimensional in nature, this title is constantly fleshing out its universe by forcing you into alternate dimensions. And it is here where I absolutely fell in love with Lost Soul Aside. Stark, hostile alien environments that contrast beautifully with the otherwise well-tread fantasy ecosystem. Levels that lean into the new weird aesthetic best seen in something like Remedy's Control. And it is here where the game really pushes forward into the puzzle solving and platform heavy sides of its level design. And this is another part of the dynamic in which I really feel like a lot of the critics may have played a lot less of this game than they really let on. The piss poor platforming at the onset of LSA is definitely remedied by the double jump and air dashes that are made available early on, but eventually a glide mechanic is made available, and by then, running around environments is a joy, especially when coupled with the air dash canceling that lets you get back on the ground in the blink of an eye. These environments are gorgeous to look at and are constantly adding wrinkles to the exploration and combat, with my favorite being a particularly hostile landscape that makes the floor unstable, and standing on it too long makes this bizarre energy wave rush you before detonating. And these wrinkles make for some fairly tight platforming that were definitely playtested to the nth degree, because some of these sequences are just on the edge of what is possible with this game's movement mechanics. But as much as I found myself vibing with this experience as it barreled towards its back half and beyond, none of that compares to the complexities and freedom of expression that is found in this game's fully unlocked combat kit. I've already outlined how good the dash canceling feels, I've already outlined the core suite of abilities, but as this game unfolds, it only becomes exponentially more complex and rewarding. First, just like any modern hack and slash game with light RPG elements, Lost Soul Aside has a full skill tree, but it has it for each of its 4 weapons. I've already talked about the basic sword and the guts weapon, but the last 2 add a fair amount of flavor to the combat and puzzle solving. You have the pole blade, which lets you channel your inner Darth Maul, and it is this game's equivalent of Ninja Gaiden's nunchucks because it is extremely spammable, but it also has a secondary mechanic where it can be used at range for hitting weak points and flipping switches in puzzle sequences. And then there is the scythe, which on paper is definitely modeled after Trish from Devil May Cry's weapon of choice, as it is used for lockdown, but it also offers something similar to a Devil Bringer mechanic for air juggles and grappling and platform sequences. But the difference between the stock versions of each of these weapons and what a fully developed weapon gives you the freedom to do are night and day in terms of implementation. And then there is a secondary tree of each weapon's core abilities that operates almost like a perk system or something similar, where you can change the properties for your most important weapon techniques. Whether we are talking about auto-tracking stinger attacks, Strider-like ranged sword slashes that can be augmented to operate like delayed judgment cuts from Virgil's kit in Devil May Cry 5, everything strings together, everything is cancelable, and switching weapons is instantaneous. You have the option of freezing time to switch between them with perfect accuracy, but once you get used to the rotation, I always went manual, as I always had this mental image of where I was in the weapon wheel and would always know whether I was going to be clicking 1, 2, or even 3 times to get to the preferred next weapon. And then there are the defensive options that lean into the offensive, like backsteps that fire off summon greatswords, and yeah man, this combat engine is sick. And there are already people who are taking it to a whole nother level. It is one of those engines that just lets you do whatever you want to. And when coupled with the relatively limited but kind of fun weapon accessory system, you can make all of your weapons look as goofy or as anime inspired as you'd like while you are laying on all of this creativity. But as we saw in Final Fantasy XVI, the breadth and depth of a combat engine doesn't really mean much without interesting enemies to fight. In 16, enemies basically boiled down to fodder enemies that could be juggled, but even on the normal difficulty, these enemies would almost always be dead by the time you finished your first rep if you were interacting with the limits of what you could do within that combat engine. And then there were the heavies, which were landlocked and required stance breaking before you could unload all of your attacks on them. But those fights always felt more like MMO style battles where rotating your cooldown abilities was the real way to cash in on the damage. Here, enemies are far more varied and resilient. The enemies that you can juggle stick around just long enough for you to get real sick with it, unleashing cool combos and having more fun than anything. Some shielded enemies can be taken to the skies once you've broken their stance, and the landlocked ones are battles where abusing your defensive techniques is what will always pay off. But then there are the bosses. Lost Soul Aside is not stingy about boss fights in the slightest. Whether we are talking about mini boss fights or just incidental encounters that almost appear out of nowhere, there is always something formidable around the corner to test your skill with, and some of them here are incredibly fun to fight. You have your big bruisers, you have your nimble mono-a-mono fights that test everything that you've learned up into that point, fights in which your mobility is just as important as your combat prowess, and then you even have those fun puzzle-style fights that require you to pay attention, execute, and be ready for the requisite dodges and parries to stay alive. Most of these fights are incredible, with the odd boss fight being one of those giant lumbering enemies that you just kind of pick at, but as far as diversity's sake is concerned, there is always something rad here. But then there are my two favorite encounters, two which really feel like they could only come from a Chinese game studio, or better yet, feel like they could only come from a country where socialist or communist ideals have really taken root. One comes almost out of nowhere. You are doing the whole puzzle exploration thing, and then a dropship fixes its sights on you, and the squad that comes out to fight you moves in convincing military formation. Shielded enemies taking ranks around an archer, with all of them moving in formation for the betterment of the squad. And the animations are spectacular. I've never fought an enemy that moved like this before. And as you pick away at their ranks and make the archer more vulnerable, I don't know, man. This shit is rad. And then there is one of the final encounters. At this point in the narrative, everything has gone to shit. Emperor Highcastle has been pretending to work with you in the back half of the story, with the existential threat of the Voidrax forcing you to collaborate with the Holy Order. And in one of the least surprising heel turns in any story ever, the Emperor has used you to try and secure limitless power for himself. And real quick, I just want to take an opportunity to really look at how good the model of Emperor Highcastle looks. And in fact, all of the Holy Order troops and their weaponry. This is some real Final Fantasy XII judges shit. And every time they were on the screen, I was always kind of transfixed. They may not be the most interesting villains from a plot perspective, but the art direction here is pretty nice.
Nice.
But back to the fight. Prior to these events, Zana, your only real ally of consequence, has more or less been broken by the events that have befallen her hometown and family. And then there's this redemption arc happening with the Virgil analog of this game, Victor. Basically, he was willing to follow the Emperor to the ends of the world, but as the conflict raged on, Victor started to notice that the ruler really didn't seem to care about the people who serve him, eventually forcing Victor to have a conflict of conscience. And so against this backdrop, the Emperor goes all Super Saiyan or whatever, and a late game boss fight begins. And it's a good fight. Tons of damage, tons of shit to dodge, tons of bullet hell near automata style attack patterns, but this is one of those battles that feels almost designed to lose. That is until face changes force Zana and later Victor into the fray. And I cannot really articulate how rad this feels in context. First, both Zana and Victor are both characters that you are forced to fight as boss encounters at certain moments within this game's narrative. Zana having been corrupted by the Voidrax, and Victor being ideologically opposed to your mission. So when they show up in this fight, when everything is looking at its bleakest, and they both use their movesets that you've been on the receiving end of, this team up against this shared threat is fucking awesome. Zana teleporting around with purple flashes, and Victor raining his trademark gold swords onto the threat. It is a fuck yeah moment if there ever was one. And all through the remainder of this plot, this story wraps up less as a story of rugged individualism where Kaiser and by extension the player is the chosen one at the center of everything, and more as a narrative where everyone, and I mean every character that you've encountered, lends their collective power to battle for the sake of everyone else. And it's kind of beautiful, especially at a time in the real world where things feel more disconnected than ever. I genuinely loved my time with Lost Soul Aside, more and more as the game went on. And ever since finishing it, there have been certain sequences that have been replaying in my mind. Amazing platforming in this room of cages, this alien speedrun challenge. Certain boss fights play out over and over whenever I think about this game, especially this one where there are full-on galaxies and black holes being thrown at you for a visual spectacle that rivals some of the more creative stuff I've seen in modern Final Fantasy titles. But more than anything, I am left with a particularly stark realization. With LSA taking as long as it did to come out, and with it coming out in a slightly compromised state with publisher meddling, I am certain of one thing. If LSA had come out in its current state, when the Unreal Engine 4 was still a big thing, if it were competing against games like Devil May Cry 5 and Nier Automata and later Final Fantasy 15 back when those were new games, I am certain that it would have still had an uphill battle being the unproven property. I am certain that it would still have required word of mouth to spread, but I fully suspect that the larger video game community would have been far more charitable and willing to try it, even if there was always going to be a vocal minority of the community which is just going to dunk on the title for being Chinese made. The Temu version of Devil May Cry, as it were. But for me, when I played these types of games, gameplay is always king. Devil May Cry itself was always cringe in its cutscenes before it became self-aware.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
And storytelling has always been relatively low on the totem pole when it comes to this genre. And the gameplay here, and the high points in the art direction, especially as this game begins to really ramp up its own identity, not only do I truly believe that more people would really love this game if they gave it a chance, granted that they were also fans of the genre to begin with, but I am also certain that the review scores here point to an increased disconnect within games coverage. Because the game that they were describing is certainly not the game that I played. I understand with the times being what they are, paying full price on a game that is in that underdog tier might be out of the question for tons of people. $60 for a title where you could easily pick up Devil May Cry 5, Nier Automata, and Final Fantasy 16, all for that price if you know how to get a deal, it's a hard ask. And considering this game's low budget, I think the price is a bit on the sent to die side by Sony. A game made with an estimated $8 million budget being put in the same price tier as games far more expensive to make? I don't know. But which one of these major video game companies really seems to be paying attention to sustainability in this day and age? All that said, if you see this game on discount in the future, maybe around that $29.99 sweet spot, or if it gets added to Sony's Premium Plus service, I cannot recommend you checking this game out enough. I absolutely adored it, and really hope that Ulti-Zero gets at least one more at bat, because in today's day and age, studios are being closed left and right. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please drop a like, comment, or subscribe if you want to see more like it. I had a great time with Lost Soul Aside, and I hope that eventually you guys get the opportunity to play it. Long live Ulti-Zero, long live Yang Bing. I cannot say enough nice things about Lost Soul Aside. It's not a perfect game, but it is a great game. That's going to be it for this video, so like always, it's on to the next one. I'm sorry that this one took so long to come out. There's been some recent changes to the YouTube algorithm that have really hurt this channel. So if you enjoyed the video, show as much support as you can. But until the next one, you're all beautiful people, and I hope you have a great day.